Okay.
I would ask you to keep your camera on throughout the webinar.
Sure.
And to just mute until you're given the floor.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We will start in 3 minutes. So John and Anne, you can now mute yourselves. Until,
okay.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are watching this particular session from. Welcome to the WTO's Virtual Agriculture Symposium, its 2020 edition on agricultural trade and food system transformation. Let me remind our viewers that there are 2 ways to follow today's proceedings. You can watch the live stream on YouTube, on the WTO YouTube channel, or register to be part of the live Q&A. For either option, please type WTO Agriculture Symposium 2020 into your browser. This will take you to a page which will have clear instructions. We look forward to your active participation. Our session this morning will look at agricultural trade and the pathways to environmental sustainability. I'm Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I will be moderating this morning's panel. I will be putting 2 rounds of questions to the panel and then taking questions from you, the viewers. Let me remind you that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens for those of you who have registered, and I will be monitoring all the questions that you send in. Now, exactly 25 years have passed since the creation of the WTO and the entry into force of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture, known as the AOA. The goal of our session this morning is to explore whether and how the agreement has allowed countries to pursue environmental sustainability and how it can better do so in future. The preamble to the agreement establishing the WTO states, the trade and economic endeavor should be conducted with a view to raising standards of living while allowing for the optimal use of the world's resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development, seeking both to protect and preserve the environment. So the founders of the WTO recognized right from the beginning the importance of environmental protection and of sustainable development, and enshrined that in the preamble of the agreement establishing the organization. In fact, the agreement on agriculture itself refers to the environment in its preamble. It states that commitments under the reform program should be made in an equitable way amongst all members, having regard to non-trade concerns, including food security and the need to protect the environment. So the agreement on agriculture itself refers to the need to protect the environment. The agreement was designed in such a manner that it would provide WTO members with what we call in WTO language, policy space, to pursue environmental objectives. For example, it contains a green box category of subsidies, which is a category of subsidies that is exempt from reduction commitments. If those subsidies meet the fundamental requirement of having no, or at most, a minimal trade distorting effect on production. Green box subsidies can be used to support environmental goals, such as environmental research, for example. The question before this panel today is whether international agricultural trade has indeed contributed to sustainable development, and going forward, whether there is a need for us to do something differently. In this panel, I believe that it will also be important to touch on international trade in relation to the climate crisis. As we all know, we're living in a rapidly warming planet where water and arable land will become increasingly scarce, in addition to all other natural resources. And as world population rises and the world's food and agricultural systems will be called upon to feed more people with less. The role of international trade in ensuring food security will become critical as countries turn to international markets to secure their food. So a very broad range of issues here. So let me now, without further ado, introduce this morning's panel to you. Anne Tutwiler is coordinator of the Policy Action Coalition of the Just Rural Transition and a senior fellow of the Meridian Institute. Welcome, Anne. Jonathan Hepburn is senior policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Welcome, Jonathan. Shenggen Fan is senior professor in China Agriculture University and former director general of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Welcome, Shenggen. Wanjira Matai is vice president and regional director for Africa at the World Resources Institute. Welcome, Wanjira. And John Clark is director in charge of international affairs in the Directorate General for Agriculture of the European Commission. Welcome, John. So let me now start with my first round of questions. Jonathan, I'd like to start with you as the representative of the Institute for Sustainable Development on this panel. Can agricultural trade, in your view, contribute to environmental sustainability, and under what conditions? And in practice, since the entry into force of the WTO agreement on agriculture, what have we seen?
Thanks very much, Doa. And before I start, I'd just like to share some apologies, because those of you who looked at the program for this event might have seen the name of Karen Smaller, International Institute for Sustainable Development's Director on Agriculture, Trade and Investment. She's very sorry that she's unable to be with us this morning. So I'm stepping in to just say a few things to try and answer this question, Doa, which is a very important one. I think the answer is yes, agricultural trade can support sustainability, but there's nothing inevitable about it. So National regulations are important. International frameworks are important. They're key, in fact. So I was thinking about the example of the deforestation in the Amazon and the biodiversity loss. We've seen rising demand for soy in particular, and for meat products around the world, soy being an important feed for animals. So that's an example of where clearly if you've got domestic regulations in place which are effective and they're implemented, then that makes a difference to the extent to which agricultural trade contributes or not to environmental sustainability. Another question, energy and food markets. We've seen that over the last decade or two, they've become increasingly interlinked. So if we look at trade and we look at the policies and rules that govern markets for food and agriculture, we need to also look at those that govern energy markets. There's no framework in place, meaningful framework for fossil fuel subsidies at the international level. That's something that has direct impacts on energy markets and therefore both directly and indirectly on markets for food and agriculture. Same thing with the carbon tax. There's no meaningful mechanism at the international level governing some of these things. The next thing to say, I think, is that governments have a tough time balancing competing priorities. Environmental sustainability is critical. Sometimes governments have to make really difficult trade-offs when they're looking at issues around agricultural trade, because not only is environmental sustainability key, food security and rural livelihoods are also critical questions that governments are dealing with. There are win-win solutions as well as trade-offs, and I think it's important to highlight some of those. A lot of our work has looked at questions such as farm subsidy reform, the agricultural domestic support issue. If we're able to reform subsidies, and the WTO is conducting work on this right now, we may be able to move towards more equitable and sustainable global markets for food and agriculture, while also improving the adaptation capacity of poor producers who may be otherwise vulnerable to extreme weather events and climatic shocks of the sort that we know are going to become more frequent and more intense due to climate change. A second issue, what about poor consumers? If you look at African countries and LDCs, the least developed countries in the world, increasingly as average incomes rise and urbanization becomes a phenomenon, then there's a need to protect poor consumers from measures such as export restrictions, especially those imposed by major agricultural exporters. There's another area where the WTO can very concretely take steps to improve the rule book and make sure that the environmental sustainability and food security impacts of future events such as climate change don't adversely impact on the lives of poor producers and consumers and improve their ability to cope with future shocks. Doa, you asked me two questions in one. So the second part of your question was about what's happened since the Agreement on Agriculture entered into force. What have we seen over the last 25 years? And the WTO has put out research which shows how trade in food and farm goods has really grown exponentially over this period, really significant growth. At the same time, I think it's really important to say that poverty and food insecurity have also witnessed historic progress in reducing these phenomena. So there are fewer poor people today. There are fewer people living in conditions of hunger and malnutrition. And that has enabled people, especially in low-income countries, to live more dignified lives and to be more resilient to environmental challenges in the future. However, I think it's important also to say that in the last few years, some of that progress has been reversed. Why has that happened? Well, conflict, extreme weather events, economic downturns, and now, of course, COVID, the coronavirus pandemic. So all these are good reasons for governments to redouble their efforts to try and update the global trade rulebook, reverse some of these trends that we've seen in the last few years, and really start moving quickly towards making sure that agricultural trade in food and farm goods contributes to environmental sustainability and the broader vision of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I very much like the fact that you have brought food security into your answer. And indeed, it's hard to talk about food security, sustainability when food security needs are unmet. And you've also spoken about the need to help poor consumers and to help farmers lead dignified lives, you said. And I think that that's all very important, and indeed, almost a prerequisite for getting to the sustainability questions. Anne, I would now like to turn to you. In the Food and Land Use Coalition's Growing Better report 2019, FOLU found that just 1% of the $700 billion a year that are given to farmers in subsidies are used to benefit the environment. Much of these subsidies, FOLU has argued, go to high emission cattle production, forest destruction, and pollution from the overuse of fertilizer. Can you walk us through some of your findings?
Thank you very much, Doa, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a delight to be back in the WTO universe after many years away. So I want to take the FOLU report as a jumping off point to talk about the just rural transition. The FOLU report was really instrumental in helping to create the just rural transition, which was launched by the UK government at the 2019 Climate Action Summit. And really what the FOLU report pointed out is the fact that we are basically spending, that agriculture systems are costing the world more than they are creating in terms of economic value because of the impacts on the environment, the impacts on human health, and the impacts on livelihoods, which Jonathan has mentioned. So one of the key levers for helping countries and to really transform their food systems is what we're calling repurposing those agricultural subsidies. So, of the, these are from OECD numbers, of this roughly $700 billion that's being spent on agricultural subsidies, about 42 billion is spent on in public goods like research, 35 billion on conservation, 14 billion on food safety. So it's a very small percentage. And what we're talking about is how can you repurpose the rest of those subsidies, or a large part of the rest of those subsidies, to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and to deliver on the Paris Climate Accord. So in thinking about how the WTO framework is helping to deliver on this this objective. First of all, I was very keen on ensuring that WTO was a partner in this initiative, one of our knowledge partners, because it's critically important that as countries shift their subsidies, and we have a number of countries who are participating in this initiative who desire to shift their subsidies in these directions. But we want to make sure that they're compliant with the WTO rules, and we think that's incredibly important. And as you mentioned, there is a significant amount of policy space, as you call it, in the WTO agreement. But if you look at some of the subsidies that are allowed in that quote green box, in environmental terms, many people would say they are not delivering green outcomes on the environment. And just to name a few, so infrastructure support is allowable under the green box. Well, depending on how that's structured, it can be, irrigation subsidies in some places can be quite detrimental to water quality and water table. Direct payments, depending if they're not conditioned on some sorts of behavior by the farmers, they can lead to perpetuation of systems that are damaging to the environment. Insurance, crop insurance, also can create incentives for farmers to be planting the wrong kinds of crops in the wrong regions because of the subsidization of the risk. So I could go on, but I think you get the point. The other thing I think where the WTO framework kind of leaves a gap is that some of the subsidies that are allowed to developing countries, like input subsidies, are in particular quite damaging to environmental and climate outcomes. So I think that one of the reasons I think the WTO was interested in participating in the Just Rule Transition, and why we were interested in having the WTO there, is, you mentioned at the beginning, Doa, that there's language in the preamble about the importance of an environment. And when I was working on trade issues a long time ago, there were some countries and nation states who were talking about the need to ensure, environmental goals were taken into account. And it was seen by a lot of others in the trade negotiations that this was just a cover story for keeping protections in place. And I think the world has shifted now, and we need to really create a framework within the WTO that also helps countries move towards more environmentally sound and policies. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Anne. Some very interesting comments there, in particular on the need to repurpose agricultural subsidies and the fact that some of the green box subsidies may not be delivering green outcomes. For those of you on this panel who may have missed the opening session yesterday, there was a lot of emphasis placed by the Director General of the FAO and by the United Nations rapporteur on the human right to food on the need to distinguish between good and bad subsidies and to find some sort of a proper balance. So indeed, subsidies seem to be a focus in the symposium. Schengen, I'd like to turn to you now. There's a lot of attention being paid to China because of its size and its role in global markets. It would be interesting if you could speak to us about how China sees the relationship between agricultural trade and environmental sustainability. In this symposium, we're celebrating 25 years of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture. Now, since China joined the WTO, its share of world imports has quadrupled, and it moved from being a net exporter of food to the world's largest net food importer. So talk to us about China, please.
Thank you, Doha. I used to work on global issues. Global environment, climate change, food, nutrition, and security, poverty, and so on. So I came back to China in January. I think working at the country level is equally, maybe even more exciting and obviously equally important. So I think obviously China really benefited from global trade. China joined the WTO in 2001. So next year, China is going to celebrate 20th anniversary of joining WTO. And as Doha said, the trade has really expanded. I mean, in the food and agriculture area, China is the largest importer of many food products, soybean, meat, and so on. So without these imports, China would have to use 70, maybe 50 to 70 million hectares of land to produce that food, that type of food. And obviously, China must use more water, emits more carbon emission, and so on. And through importing, the Chinese food and nutrition security have also improved significantly. So we don't see much hunger at all, the visible hunger. Obviously, hidden hunger, overweight, obesity are still here. So the China really benefited from the environmental perspective, food and nutrition security perspective. Now, I wanted to talk about the future. I think China must continue to depend on trade or use trade to make sure that not only the Chinese population will have access to healthy, nutritious foods and to protect its own environment. Here, I wanted to emphasize that Chinese trade should also help to protect the global environment and help to ensure global food and nutrition security. For the last couple of months, maybe 6 months, China has made several significant commitments. The one is carbon neutrality by 2060. That's a big deal. So carbon neutrality by 2060. And then China is also committed to host a very successful summit on biodiversity. And lastly, not the least, the President Xi Jinping made a commitment during the G20 summit to host a global conference on reducing food waste and loss. I mean, this is probably the first that's a national figure who try to commit to the food waste and food loss. So as you can see, all these commitments will really help to achieve much better environment, to cut down the carbon emission inside of China. But here, I think China should also make sure that its import will not, let's say, destroy, let's say, the global environment or climate. So for example, China imports quite large amount of soybean from Brazil.
I think we may have lost you there, Schengen. Schengen, I will let you try and reconnect, and I will move on to Wanjira. Wanjira, is agricultural trade contributing to environmental sustainability in Africa? And what is WRI seeing in Africa on the ground?
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be with you. You know, it's very interesting to hear, especially what Anne was addressing around the subsidy issue, because when we remember the real intention of the agricultural trade agreement was to aim to see if we could have fairer competition and less distortion in the sector. And that's, I have to say, unfortunately, is not, we're not there yet. So the short answer would be at the moment, no. And in fact, it's quite the contrary, because I think it's important to say up front that generally today, especially in the market for African food consumers, especially urban consumers, I would say, they don't really care where their food comes from. They are driven by a quest for quality and the best possible price. And so when you look at international trade, especially around agricultural commodities, it is multiple times more cheaper, for example, to purchase rice from Southeast Asia than it is to purchase rice from Africa, anywhere within the continent. And it's always even cheaper to purchase poultry products, for example, from South America than it is from Africa. So these distortions are there. But what this makes African markets a little bit extremely vulnerable. And we saw that with COVID-19, when supply chains are interfered with, the demand and supply side shocks are devastating. And that's also why the food systems transformation is such an important part of how Africa builds back better. So we're seeing, particularly around that, the issue of sustainability, environmental sustainability relegated in many ways to the back burner. And obviously that has to change going forward. And there are some really good signals. I want to mention in particular investments in small scale farmers and investments in the small and medium enterprises, which will be a big part of shortening value chains, investing in those who actually produce our food. When you look at the African situation, 70% of small scale farmers are women, and those small scale farmers produce 80% of the food that's consumed. So it follows that women produce 80% of the food that's consumed. And so we have to invest in them, especially then this is in non-industrialized countries, but we've got to therefore invest in them, equip them with the right capacity. And that is part of building in and addressing the environmental sustainability. I'll also mention the urgency for youth. We are very young continents, young people in Africa, the youngest in the world. And so engaging them and ensuring that they engage with the agricultural sector, really important. But what that also means is that we have to invest in a lot more market transparency, price predictability, so that they are incentivized to join. And then finally, I'll just say that the entry of the Africa Free Trade Agreement will also allow for a lot more intra-Africa trade. And that has been a really great the promise of that agreement quite exciting, and shortening otherwise very long supply chains, and allowing hopefully for more transformative, sustainable, and then also environmentally sustainable growth. Thanks, Dora.
Thank you, Wanjira, for that. Of course, it is understandable that the price of food and the quality of food be the priority of the African continent. It is normal when there is poverty that becomes the priority. And thank you for pointing out that we need to invest in women and youth if we want to start creating a different perspective. Schengen, I'd like to go back to you. You were cut off. You were just telling us about how China needs to look not only at its exports, but also its imports. And you had started speaking to us about soybeans.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, very good, very good. Yes, so obviously China will continue to import, but China should also make sure that these imports help the origin of the imports more sustainable. I think there are several ways that can be pursued. The one is through South-South cooperation. Some of the conservation practices from China can be shared from some of the countries like in Africa, in South Asia, and so on, and even with Brazil. So that scientists can work together to make sure that soybean produced in Brazil is sustainable, low carbon, and beyond. So that's number one. Number two is the consumers here in China. I think the consumers needs to be aware what they consume is not only important for their health, their nutrition, it is also very important for their for the environment. So if the consumers can demand the whole supply chain, global supply chain, are sustainable, so they will drive the whole value chain to be sustainable. And here, you know, I think labeling of imported products will be so critical. Green, yellow, or red, so the consumers can choose, you know, sustainable products they can consume. Now, obviously, I also wanted to make a point here that during the next round of WTO negotiation, we needed to make sure that food and nutrition security, particularly nutrition, you know, and environment sustainability, be part of the negotiations. And can we use some of the trade policies to make sure that the imports, exports, and the production will be sustainable, will produce healthy and nutritious foods. Thank you, Dua.
Thank you very much, Schengen. I think you've covered China both internally and externally. Of course, its announcement that it plans to aim for carbon neutrality by 2060 made headlines around the world and is very exciting news. But as you rightly pointed out, there's also the obligation to look at what one is importing. And hence all the complications that then arise in the trade world. How far can we go in imposing environmental requirements on what we import? And we will get to that, I'm sure, in the Q&A. John, I will now like to turn to you. The EU is a strong proponent of environmental sustainability in the WTO across the board and not just on agriculture. Can you tell us about what the EU is specifically doing to green its agricultural trade?
Well, thank you, Dora, and thank you for allowing me to be with such a distinguished group of panelists. This is a very big question to try to answer in 3 or 4 minutes. It's a bit like the Monty Python sketch where the contestants in a TV quiz show are asked to summarize the works of Proust in 15 seconds. It's not easy, but I will try. I would start by saying that the EU has not been sitting on its hands in the last 30 years when it comes to promoting sound environmental practices in farming. Around the same time as the Marrakesh Agreement, which reflected and recognized sustainability as part of the WTO system. In the EU, we reformed our own agricultural policy to a more green and less trade distortive model. And the 2003 CAP reform is really a seminal step forward in making support to farmers conditional upon sound environmental practice. And the proof of the pudding lies in the fact that the EU is the only major agricultural producing region, which in the last 30 years has both increased production and level of productivity, while at the same time reducing by over 20% our greenhouse gas emissions. But we need to go further. The EU agricultural sector is responsible for around 10% of EU GHG emissions, and that reduction has been flattening out in the last decade. And a recent European survey showed that the European public believe that farmers are trying to preserve the environment, but they need to do much more. Now, you've probably heard of the European Green Deal, which is a commitment by Europe to go beyond our formal Paris climate targets and become the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. And that's not just a political commitment. The target of climate neutrality has been enshrined in law. So, you know, through legislation, we've lashed ourselves to the mast of the ship like Odysseus. And the agricultural sector, along with transport and construction, is one of the key sectors that will have to help reach that target. So how do we get there? Broadly speaking, in two ways. The first way will be through the instruments of the future Common Agricultural Policy, now being debated in the Council and the Parliament, and which will enter into force in January 2023. And the new CAP proposes, and forgive me if I simplify, that a minimum of 40% of the EU agricultural budget will be used to incentivize farmers to apply environmentally friendly farming practices or compensate them for any additional costs in doing so. Each EU member state will have to prepare and get approval for a strategic plan showing in evidence-based terms how it will reach the environment and climate targets set out. Now, this is the subject of a lot of debate at the moment. Some member states think that and some farm groups think we're being too ambitious. Others, notably civil society, NGOs, think we're not going far enough. So perhaps, you know, on that basis, the balance is about right. We will see. But the second strand of our policy towards climate neutrality and a greener farm sector is the so-called farm to fork strategy published early this year. This is not legislation at this point. It's a set of policy proposals and targets. The legislation to achieve those targets will be introduced progressively over the next 4 years. And the farm to fork strategy, in short, takes a whole food systems approach to improving the sustainability of farming and the food system at all points of the production and supply chain. The COVID crisis has shown how important it is to have a resilient food system, including openness to trade. But that resilience can only be really guaranteed if that food system is sustainable in the long term. And in fact, they are almost synonyms to each other. Now, an important part of the strategy will fall upon the farm sector in Europe to implement. I would cite in particular the target of achieving 25% of land under organic production by 2030, up from just 8% today, halving the use of pesticides by the same date, reducing fertilizer use by 20%, a 50% reduction in antibiotic sales and use in the livestock sector, and a target elsewhere of ensuring that 10% of agricultural land is effectively put out of production to improve biodiversity, where we have some serious challenges. Universal access to broadband in rural areas is another target, and that will be key for farmers to both gain productivity and also apply environmentally friendly practices with fewer inputs, but that's another subject. Now, obviously, Europe cannot or should not go it alone when it comes to achieving a more climate-friendly farm sector. We'll be working in the months ahead with our partners in WTO, in FAO, in the G20, and above all, bilaterally, to encourage others to raise their game similarly. This is not about achieving a level playing field between European farmers and third countries. It's really a frank recognition that, you know, if only the EU meets its Paris commitments or its climate neutrality objective, then the climate crisis we face is not going to go away. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a great overview for our viewers. And of course, many different trade issues flow from that, which we will get to, I'm sure, in the Q&A. I would now like to start my second round of questions. And Anne, I will start with you. The Food and Land Use Coalition has spoken of the need for a planetary health diet, one that requires serious cut to red meat consumption by Europeans and North Americans in particular. Adopting this diet in the coming decades would mean that 60% of today's pasture could be used for wildlife or other purposes. So that's an area similar in size to Brazil. So do you think that this planetary health diet is really feasible? And what is the role of consumption habits in sustainable agricultural trade?
Thanks, Stella. Look, I think this planetary diet has galvanized a conversation around these issues that you put forward, and it's been an important instigator for some of those conversations. I think we have to really take into account the consumption side of this, food systems transformation that we're talking about. We all tend to talk a lot about what consumers or what producers are doing, and the need for producers to make the kinds of changes that John just mentioned and Schengen mentioned. But there has to be consumers on the other side of that who are demanding and wanting, more sustainable food. I think we put a lot of emphasis on red meat and rice, certainly because those are two of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions when you look at across the board. But I think the point is, we really need to move people, not talk about foods when we talk about, consumption habits, but we need to think about, what is a diverse, sustainable diet that is going to deliver to consumers on their health in particular, and in their and in this environmental sustainability that we've been talking about. Consumers are starting to shift and be more conscious of these issues, and I think the large food companies around the world, not just the big guys that we always talk about, but regional companies as well, are really beginning to think of what is their role in offering consumers foods that are more environmentally sustainable, more healthy, and so I think there's a lot that can be done to in the private sector side to shape what consumers are being offered. And I think Wandjiri made a great point that the food has to be safe and it has to be affordable for people. But also, government policies can do a lot to shape what consumers think of as a healthy or appropriate diet. And that's another aspect of this just real transition, is as we're thinking about how to repurpose these agricultural subsidies, part of that is also, how can you use the policy levers to help shape a better, a more sustainable diet and a healthier diet for people. If I could just maybe make a couple of points in reference to Wandjiri's comments about Africa, and it's certainly clear, when we talk about the subsidies, that's mainly an OECD and a few other countries phenomenon. But the just real transition, we're embracing more looking at policy reforms. And in Africa, despite the fact that the sector is still being actually underfinanced from government, there are very few countries that have met the CAADP targets. There are still policies that are harmful to producers and that can be shaped to help encourage producers to be more productive, to supply more local markets. So it's not only about repurposing that big bucket of subsidies that we talked about, it's also helping shape policies in other parts of the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Anne. So it's a bit more nuanced than a dictated diet, is what I gather from your comments. Wanjira, let me come to you. From a World Resources Institute perspective, can international trade help us overcome resource scarcity? The UNDP, for instance, tells us that if a country like Egypt were to aim for food self-sufficiency, it would need 3 river Niles, not 1. What is your perspective on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, the answer is yes, but that trade obviously needs to be fair, and of course countries would need to address the significant trade barriers that sometimes result in that resource scarcity. So, and in particular, non-trade barriers are a major part of that. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, I think the Continental Free Trade Agreement for Africa is a real opportunity for us to unlock what has been perhaps thus far a bit crippling, accessing markets in a way that is fair for Africans, and it will also open local markets. The market itself, 3.4 trillion in size for the entire African market, and as far as the CFTA is concerned, that's a very significant part, and very little of that is even currently in play. And I know also that from the Economic Commissioner for Africa that if we were to eliminate a lot of the trade barriers that exist and a lot of what holds trade back, import duties and others, that we could boost intra-Africa trade by up to 52%. And I think that would address so much of the resource scarcity that we see. So yes, international trade could do that, but it needs to be done in the spirit of what the objectives of a framework or an instrument like the CFTA is offering.
Thank you very much for that, Wanjira. Schengen, I'd like to follow up on Wanjira's answer. So if international trade in food is trade in embedded land and water, what is the impact then of food export restrictions on the environment?
Yeah, well, firstly, I think this sort of environmental externalities, whether it's carbon emission, water use, overuse of energies, have to be internalized in pricing of these foods when they are traded across the border. As you know, the different foods are produced in different regions, and they have different environmental footprints, whether it's climate change, whether it's water. Water is obviously very difficult, but the climate change is a common bad, it's a global bad. I mean, we can really use minimizing or even carbon neutral as a goal for our trade. So trade is the best way to make the carbon emission minimized. So I think IPRI has done some studies to look at the trade patterns when we try to use carbon emission as a goal, to reduce or minimize or even zero carbon emission. So the trade is the best way to do that. Now, I wanted to make a couple of points about the red meat. Obviously, red meat, it's not only bad for our environment, it's also bad for our nutrition, our health. So I want to make that point. And another point we need to point is for Africans, particularly African children, they still need to eat more meat, animal source proteins. We know that access to animal proteins will help these children to grow stronger, smarter, and probably more productive in the future. So we cannot just use one, let's say, cookie cutter and use it for everybody. I think even in terms of the environment, how can we really make sure that in the past, different countries have already emitted lots of carbon emissions that have contributed to global warming. And let's say for the countries like Africa, they have done very little in terms of carbon emission, and they need a special treatment to make sure that what they are going to do is to produce healthy, nutritious foods for everybody in the continent, particularly children and women. So I think that, yes, trade remains very important in terms of minimizing carbon emission, in terms of ensuring everybody have access to healthy and nutritious foods. So absolutely. So any trade restrictions will be bad, even particularly during crisis like COVID-19 and 2007, 2008 food price crisis. I think 2007, 2008 food price crisis, because of trade, export bans, restrictions, millions of people suffered from hunger, suffered from poverty. The good thing about it this time is the G20 ministers of agriculture made a declaration saying that no country should use export bans. I think after that, indeed, many countries begin to roll back some of their plans for export ban. That's good news. Let's continue to do that. So no restrictions will be applied in the future. Going back to you, thank you, Dua.
Thank you very much, Schengen. And indeed, food export restrictions have been a running theme throughout this symposium. Jonathan, I would like to turn to you. Now, economic growth has taken a serious hit from the COVID-19 crisis, and we now know that global GDP is expected to fall by about 5% this year. In many parts of the world, people are talking of the need for a green recovery. Is a green recovery really possible under the circumstances? And what is the role of agricultural trade in that green recovery?
So thanks, Doa. Yeah. I mean, I think the WTO has actually done some fantastic work helping everyone to understand what the impact of COVID-19 has been and what it means for an eventual green recovery. The Secretariat has put out some numbers and some analysis which shows how there were different phases of what happened with COVID-19 so far this year, and different types of impacts. So firstly, you've got the disruption to food value chains, which I think a lot of people are very aware of, and that was especially in the initial first shock associated with not just the COVID pandemic itself, but the government lockdowns and the various public health measures, which, while necessary, had a big impact on markets in food and agriculture and in other areas. And that brings me to the second impact, which is people's jobs and incomes and livelihoods were and have been and still are affected by these different types of measures. And that has had a knock-on food security impact, which will be a big challenge for the recovery, and in particular for how we design policies that contribute to a green recovery. Looking back at what's happened so far this year, so trade has really been important in different ways, and it's not just trade in food and agriculture. If you look at what's happened, there have been falling remittances as people's jobs in the hotel sector or tourism were affected. The collapse in flights, that's a type of trade in services, which has really affected low-income countries, especially countries where people may have already been living a bit at the margins from a food security perspective. Different types of products have been affected differently. We heard this yesterday in the speakers' interventions in the symposium. Staples trade has been relatively robust. If you look at grains and products that are shipped around the world in container ships, things like fruit and vegetables or cut flowers, much more of an impact. So as trade has really collapsed, at least at a particular moment in time. So all these things need to be brought into our thinking as we try and work out what a green recovery would look like, how we make sure that agricultural trade contributes to that. And I guess it's important to say that it's got to be part of a bigger package as well. Agricultural trade and trade in food and farm goods needs to be part of a bigger vision, which also includes aid and investment in the farm sector. We know that business as usual is not sufficient. And I think this brings us back to the talks at the WTO. We need to find a way, governments need to find a way to reboot the talks on agriculture and on food at the WTO as part of a bigger vision of what a green recovery would look like. And to get to that point, I think it's really important that we rebuild trust. We rebuild trust and confidence in not just in food and agricultural markets themselves, but also in the institutions and the governance frameworks that we have, which have taken a big hit in different types of ways over the last few years. One area, Schengen's just talked in depth about export restrictions. One area where there may be a very concrete way in which countries could do that would be to take a decision at the upcoming WTO General Council meeting, where there's a proposal in front of members on this very specific issue of food aid, humanitarian food aid that's delivered by the World Food Programme. in commercial terms, it's relatively insignificant, but in humanitarian terms, in terms of the lives of the people affected, it could be a very significant thing, and it could help to get the ball rolling in terms of this much bigger agenda, which Anne's talked about, which John's talked about, Schengen, everybody on this panel has really spelt out. So, and as Schengen said, it could also show a way of translating into action some of the commitments that were made in the G20 statement, and show how governments can really take very concrete steps to ensure that food security and environmental sustainability take precedence over commercial considerations when vulnerable people's lives are at stakes in emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. And indeed, rebuilding trust in institutions is important. John, I'd like to come back to you. Now, one country's non-trade concerns are another country's trade concerns. So what would you say to some of the criticism we hear of the EU's farm to fork policy and its potential to usher in WTO inconsistent policies?
Thank you, Dora. Well, let me say the EU is very well aware of its WTO commitments, and of course we'll comply with them. And the farm to fork strategy underlines on several occasions that we will respect fully WTO rules when it comes to trade and imports. I mean, and taking a step back, our own agricultural exports suffer enough from WTO incompatible practices of some of our partners or protectionist measures. So we have every reason to be firm ourselves in applying the WTO rule book. As Shakespeare said, we are more sinned against than sinning. So we will continue to lead by good example. The adults are in the room on this. We understand we need to base our regulatory decisions on a legitimate objective. Our rules must be non-discriminatory. There must be the least trade restrictive means to achieve that legitimate objective. And of course, must not represent a disguised trade restriction. And consultation and transparency upstream would be an essential element of the regulatory approach. So as a matter of credibility, the EU's leadership in multilateralism and our self-interest as the world's biggest exporter and importer, we have every interest in following the letter and spirit of WTO. And frankly, there is, I think you touched on this in your opening remarks, Doa, there is no disconnect between high levels of environmental protection and adherence to the WTO rulebook. The rules provide ample scope for members to adopt environmental protection policies, and the objective, as you said, of sustainability and the environment is important enough to be now part of the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement. The Article 20 exception is well known to us all, and there is plenty of gap jurisprudence today guiding us on what is and what is not permitted under environmental rules that may impact on trade. And frankly, you know, the WTO is not about a race to the bottom. It's a race upwards, and it would be inconceivable that the WTO would be seen as a constraint on achieving the Paris goals that almost everybody has signed up to achieving a meaningful outcome in next year's UN Food Systems Summit, or indeed achieving the SDGs, which we've all, without exception, I think, signed up to. Now, I have heard some concerns expressed by a few members, notably in relation to pesticide use and the possibility of prohibiting imports of products used using certain pesticides which are banned in the EU. I think there is a virtual consensus that the use of certain pesticides does raise serious environmental concerns, such as impacting on the worldwide decline of pollinators, or issues related to persistent organic pollutants. And these concerns cannot be brushed under the carpet, and it means that in some cases where there are serious environmental concerns of a transboundary nature, we may reduce import tolerances or simply not have any import tolerance at all for products on our market that have been using those pesticides. But as I said, we will apply the rule book very strictly here. We'll take decisions on a case-by-case basis, drawing on the best available scientific evidence, and of course ensuring that our measures are no more trade restrictive than necessary to achieve a legitimate objective. So I think our trading partners need not worry. We will be engaging very, very actively with all of our trading partners who have interest in these areas, notably with developing country exporters to the EU, and in particular Africa, which is very dependent on the EU market for commodity exports. So we will be working with our partners to accompany the transition over the next decade towards a more sustainable use of pesticides, so that we avoid trade disruptions, and we find alternative plant protection products and methods that will ensure that trade continues to flow, and that we remain faithful to our WTO obligations. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that answer. So we will start taking questions from viewers. Anne, I have a couple of questions for you. So the first question is from a viewer who wants to know more about the just rural transition. Can you tell us more about that? And second, on your comments on the need to repurpose agricultural subsidies, moving from environmentally harmful subsidies to subsidies that can be more beneficial. The viewer is asking, how do you do that, practically speaking, given the stalemate in WTO negotiations, not only in agriculture, but also in the fishery subsidies negotiations? Subsidies are very difficult to tackle.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll put a link in the chat to the Just Rural Transition website after I'm done speaking. But the Just Rural Transition, like I said, was created in September 2019 during the UN Climate Action Summit by the UK, and it is now comprised of about 50 countries and I would say knowledge partners and other institutions who are really a community of purpose of institutions, and WRI is one of the members, leading members of the Just Rural Transition, that are institutions that are really dedicated to this notion of, that we need to transform our food systems to be meeting the Paris goals, meeting the SDGs, living within planetary boundaries. There is the repurposing policy arm, which I am leading and which I talked about earlier. There's also an investment partnership network, which goes to Wanjiri's point about trying to get more private investment flowing into countries that is going to be supporting rural livelihoods. And I think the whole idea is that the Just Rural Transition really puts people at the center of this need to transform food systems, because so many times we are just talking about the environment in sort of abstract terms, but it really comes down to how that affects people's lives. So people and farmers are very central. The World Farmers Organizations is one of our key partners and key members of the Just Rural Transition, and it is a community that's open to others who would like to join. And one of the things we're going to be trying to do in the next year is there are a number of big conversations going on: the Food System Summit, which I think John mentioned, the COP26 that the UK is hosting, the Nutrition Summit, the Biodiversity Summit, which Schengen mentioned. These are all interconnected, and we can't treat them as individual issues and summits. And I think the Just Rural Transition can help put, as we're calling it, a green thread through all of those global conversations, the G7, G20, that are happening so that we have consistency. On the repurposing subsidy piece, I should have pointed out earlier, this is a country level initiative, and it is comprised of countries who have put their hands up and said, we want to reform our policies. We know that these policies are not delivering on the public goods that we want them to. So it's a way, in a way, a coalition of the willing. So we're working with countries at the local level in conjunction with the World Bank, who is also a key partner here, to try to, when a country puts its hand up and says, we want to reform our fertilizer subsidies, or we want to shift, we're trying to help bring the expertise and guidance to countries as they're doing that. The other key piece that I would like to mention is a peer-to-peer exchange. And this is where the example of what the EU is doing, what China is doing, to try to move its system more in this direction, can be shared with other countries who may be at earlier stages of that thinking. So it is very much at the national level, and I think we hope some of these conversations bubble up into the WTO and other venues where frameworks are being discussed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anne. Jonathan, let me turn to you. A viewer is saying, based on the introduction that I gave to this session, that there is a difference between the WTO agreement giving countries policy space and an agreement that would actually allow countries to impose conditionalities for trade, environmental conditionalities. And they are saying that the environment should be a condition for trade, environmental protection. What would you say to that? Policy space versus conditionality?
That's a very tricky question. I mean, I think that's not how the WTO framework is set up. It's set up in a way that countries, excuse me, countries themselves come up with the policy framework that seems to work for them, and then they come and negotiate concessions at the international level on trade, which conform to public policy goals, or which should conform to public policy goals that they've identified at the national level, including the environment. So, of course, there are other spaces like the Paris climate deal, which has come up a number of times, other conversations elsewhere, whether they're on nutrition, whether they're on greenhouse gas emissions, where countries can also have a parallel conversation about where they think international efforts towards more sustainable but also more equitable outcomes are needed. And those conversations take place in parallel. And I think they can and should feed back into what governments come to the WTO and say down at the Rue de Lausanne. I think it's quite important that the conversations in the WTO don't take place in isolation, and that the conversations in national capitals and in regional spaces also don't take place in conversation, but that they're linked up. Anne talked about a green thread. It would be very good to get a green thread that goes that at least ties more tightly some of the conversations that take place in Geneva with those that take place in other centres of decision making, whether they're around national policies or whether they're around parallel processes at the international level aimed at more sustainable and equitable outcomes. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. So flowing from that, let me come to you, John. There are a lot of questions on the EU's border carbon adjustment initiative and whether that is a conditionality for trade and how that may impact the agricultural sector. So that's the first sort of area that I would like you to comment on, John. And then second, viewers also want to know your opinion on how the logjam can be broken on agricultural subsidy negotiations.
Okay, thank you, Doe. Well, good questions from an audience who are obviously very, very wide awake. On the carbon border adjustment mechanism, The intention at the moment is that this would not apply to agricultural and food products. It would apply to carbon intensive sectors such as cement or steel. So that's the first point. The second point is we've just concluded a public consultation on this idea in the EU. We're now looking at the input, and we will come up with a proposal in the spring, which will be subject to a comprehensive impact assessment. So it's very early days for this instrument, which we hope to introduce in the years ahead. But as I said, it is not the intention that it would apply to agriculture and food products. In the Farm to Fork strategy, we have proposed a sustainability labelling scheme for agricultural and food products on the EU market, be they domestic or imports, and that will be developed over the next 3 or 4 years, and that in some ways would be an alternative to the CBAM. What one has to keep in mind the reasons to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. If we want to achieve climate goals, our Paris commitments, we can't do it if our measures internally inside the EU simply lead to carbon leakage in other parts of the world who don't share the same kind of concerns or ambitions. So we have to apply this to both imports and domestic production. And coming back to a point I made earlier on, measures which are grounded in science, which are not protectionist, which are seeking to tackle a global or transboundary environmental objective, they are in principle WTO compatible, and the CBAM will definitely be WTO compatible for those reasons. On your second question on how to restart the engine on agricultural subsidies in the WTO, we would like to, from the EU point of view. We have seen in the last few years that as we've moved dramatically from amber box to green box support, some of the other major partners have gone in the opposite direction. USA and India in particular, to some extent China, and so we have I think there is a global interest in trying to put a lid on this and try to shift the system towards less distortion and reduction of these subsidies, and that would very much correspond to what Jonathan Hepburn described as having a more supportive relationship between the WTO rulemaking function and sustainability and resilience issues in the agri-food area. So we would very much like to see this. The question is how. We tried very hard before Buenos Aires, together with Brazil and Mexico and others. We had a common proposal to start to reduce amber box support. That did not fly. It was effectively blocked by US, India, and a couple of others. And the situation does not seem to us to have developed yet in the right direction for that approach to fly in the near future. But we don't lose hope. We would like to use the kind of the discussion environment around food sustainability, food systems, the Food Systems Summit next year, and all of this to try to repurpose the debate a little bit in the WTO, to use a phrase that Anne used at the beginning, so that countries will take a fresh look at the issue of subsidization and start to really rethink what kind of subsidy policies could we be proposing the WTO which would meet the SDGs and the different climate and other goals that we've signed up to as a starting point to build confidence. I very much share Jonathan's idea or support for a decision quite soon in the WTO to exempt from export restrictions World Food Programme purchases. That would be a very important symbolic step. And also, I think there's an agenda on transparency which needs to be pursued. We have some real difficulties in the WTO in terms of the transparency and notification of subsidy regimes around the world. It's not working, and unless we have transparency, that's the starting point for anything more ambitious on subsidization. So I think we should also focus in the months ahead on seeing if we can improve the rules on transparency. That will be a very good, I think, first step towards a bigger initiative on subsidization more generally.
Thank you very much for that. Schengen, I'd like to turn to you. There's a question from a viewer on developing country status in the WTO, which is a very complicated issue, not only in the WTO, but in many international negotiations. Whether there is a need to revisit the issue, who is a developing country and who isn't. And under the WTO agreement on agriculture, of course, developing countries have access to a category of uncapped subsidies, investment and input subsidies, some of which our viewers are saying are actually harmful to the environment. Over to you, Schengen.
Yeah, well, thank you. I do think where the countries are moving towards higher categories of income level, yeah, obviously we can revisit that. But it seems to me, regardless of development levels, there are some common objectives we should really pursue: the environment, the nutrition, and so on. Now, let me come back to the questions posted to Anne and Tatjana on repurposing of subsidies. I think it's not just the OECD, US. I think it's every country: India, China, Brazil, Africa, and so on. So how can we really make sure that I would call it support to agriculture can generate a positive outcome, whether environment, whether it's nutrition, or smallholders' income. In fact, in many countries, I used to work for IPRI. Where I have done some studies to look at the returns to the subsidies, India, in Africa. Usually, farmers don't benefit much from there. Sometimes, actually, the consumers who benefit more from the subsidies. So now, sometimes we said, oh, we use the subsidies to protect producers or smallholder farmers. Actually, in many cases, it's not true. It is probably the consumers. And there are better ways to protect the smallholders. For example, by providing good technology to them, by providing direct income support, or by providing extension services. So I think you have many different ways to help smallholders to really improve their prosperity. Non-tenure system, many others. So repurposing really means, let's look at the current subsidies. How can we really repurpose them to benefit smallholders, consumers, the environment? And I do see there's a great opportunity here in China. I think that the country is already doing that. I think since 2015, 2016, the total subsidies have come down. Number one. Number two, the composition of subsidies have really shifted from direct input subsidies to let's say, income support, to some extent, some output price support, and more importantly, environmental compensation. So I was in Hebei province, where the underground water level has really come down to a historical level. So now a new policy was introduced to compensate farmers for not using underground water. So you will be surprised, almost $1,000 per hectare to compensate farmers not to use underground water. So direct income. And then, okay, farmers stop producing maize or wheat, and they begin to produce let's say, water-saving crops like sorghum. They make the same amount of money. So I think it's already shifting. I think India probably is thinking the same way. I think we're working with the World Bank on several cases, as Anne mentioned. So India, probably some African countries, Indonesia. I think just even from a developing country's perspective, they needed to look at the subsidies differently. What sort of objective or goals they really wanted to achieve? What sort of, let's say, support that can be used to achieve these goals? And lots of data required, and lots of analysis required, and lots of, obviously, political economy issues we need to tackle. Going back to you, Dua.
Thank you very much for that. We seem to have lost Wanjira momentarily. I believe she's trying to reconnect. In the meantime, John, I would like to come back to you. We have a question from a viewer on the palm oil dispute that has been brought by Indonesia against the EU at the WTO, and which has to do with the Renewable Energy Directive of the EU. And the viewer is asking whether climate issues are now creeping into the WTO.
Well, I would say that climate issues have been in the WTO for quite a long time. This is not new. This issue is a bit sub judice, I would say, because it's subject to a panel that Indonesia is bringing against the EU, against our Renewable Energy Directive, which determined that palm oil from Indonesia and Malaysia, along with canola from some other countries, do not meet the sustainability footprint to qualify for privileged treatment under the directive. So I mean that is in simple terms the issue. Our directive is non-discriminatory. It treats similar products identically, but we judge that palm oil is not being produced sustainably, and we are, apart from the WTO panel case, which is fair enough. Indonesia has every right to take a case if it wishes. I think that it takes a big risk in doing it, frankly, but that's their judgment. In addition, we are working in a more consensual way, I would say, with Indonesia and Malaysia in an EU ASEAN working group on sustainable vegetable oils, notably palm oil, where we're looking at really going back to the to traceability issues and the whole supply chain, what we can do in terms of development cooperation, sustainability certification systems, in order to make this sector more sustainable in the long term. So it's not only about litigation. We're also in parallel engaged in a fairly constructive dialogue, I would say, with those two major suppliers of palm oil to Europe.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. In terms of the Paris climate commitments, what do they say on agriculture, and what will their impact be on this particular sector? Can you give us an overview?
Sure. I mean, I'm not an expert on Paris, but basically the structure of the Paris Agreement is this building blocks approach. Countries come with national level commitments, and they bring those back to the international community, and there's a ratcheting up of the level of ambition. And so hopefully what you would see over time, and we need to see this quite quickly, is that translates into the sorts of things that all the people on the panel have been talking about in terms of what this means for a more rational, more efficient, more sustainable, more equitable use of resources, both at the global level and the national level, which can be translated into the sorts of commitments that countries would want to make at the WTO. That's, I think, the direction of travel that countries need to be able to envisage. Thanks.
Thank you. Schengen, a question on On COVID and the SDGs, SDG 2 calls upon countries to end hunger and malnutrition by 2030. Has COVID created a setback for our ability to achieve those goals?
Well, the simple answer is yes, absolutely, absolutely. So the analysis from IPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute, and the World Bank, and WFP, FAO, clearly showed that the hunger actually will rise. By the end of this year, we will see 130 million more acute hungry people. You know, before COVID-19, it was 135. So basically, we will double the number of acute hunger. Acute means very severe hunger. So that if the people do not have enough to eat, if their situation do not improve, so their health, even their life, will be damaged. Now, in terms of extreme poverty, you know, the World Bank, FAO again said that by the end of this year, we could see 100 million, maybe 150 million more extreme poor falling into poverty. So definitely, the situation is very serious. And business as usual, by 2030, we will see 820 million hungry people. So instead of zero, that's SDG 2, the goal is to end hunger, zero hunger. Now, it's not zero, it will be even more, 820 million hungry people. So yes, we have seen some setup. So that's why I really argue that during the recovery with the green growth, yes, green growth, absolutely. We must look at people's hunger, malnutrition, health very seriously. Combine these two together. It's green development, sustainable development, but in the meantime, hunger and the malnutrition goals must not be compromised. And we have certain technologies, we have certain, let's say, investment priorities that can achieve both. Going back to you.
Thank you. A follow-up question, Jonathan, on dispute settlement in the WTO and the entry of climate and environmental issues into the WTO. Is the WTO equipped to settle disputes with an environmental angle, and does it consult the environmental community in doing so?
There has been a series of disputes over the years where trade and environment have been at the intersection, going right back to the sort of the turtle disputes and the shrimp turtle things right back at the time of Seattle. So this is 20 years ago. And I think clearly members agree that the WTO is not an environmental authority. It's not got expertise on environmental issues, but it also needs to take into account environmental questions when deciding on matters that come before it. My impression is that the way the WTO agreements are crafted is to allow the room that countries need to take environmental considerations into account when they're designing policy and they're designing rules, national laws that affect markets in food and agriculture and also in other areas. So the question is how countries go about taking those environmental considerations into account when they do their initial policy planning. And one of the big challenges that the WTO faces at the moment is a much more fundamental level one, which is about the operation of the dispute settlement process in itself. Clearly, you still have the operation of panels, but the appellate body function has been effectively discontinued because of the disagreements between members on that issue. I'm not a legal expert, so I don't want to go into the intricacies on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And indeed, the WTO does consult outside experts in the context of its dispute settlement understanding. There is a specific provision for it to do so. And indeed, that provision has been used in the past. And I believe that environmental and trade considerations have been kept in balance through the rulings that have come out in a number of trade-related environmental disputes that the WTO has adjudicated. So that's to also complete your answer, Jonathan, which was quite comprehensive in any case. We're coming to the end of our webinar, and before closing, I would just like to give each and everyone an opportunity to identify what you think are the priorities for achieving sustainability in agricultural trade. Are there 2 to 3 priority actions that you would point to in your closing remarks? Let me start with you, Schengen.
Yeah, I think COVID-19 is really a wake-up call for us to rethink of future global food system. Before the COVID-19, we knew that our food system must produce healthy, nutritious foods, must be sustainable, must be low carbon, must be, let's say, inclusive to some extent. But I think COVID-19 really made the resilience much more important. So how can we make sure that our future food system, including trade system related to food and agriculture, can take into consideration of resilience more seriously in designing our policies in the future? Thank you.
Anne, let me give you the floor.
Yeah, thanks. So I think to me, one of the things that the WTO could be doing in this space is to really take a look at the subsidies that are allowed in the green box, the blue box, the amber box, et cetera, and really engaged in conversation with members about, what are the environmental, and I think Schengen put it very well, the nutritional impacts of some of these subsidies that are allowed in these different boxes, and whether or not there's a way to, open up some policy space in other areas, but maybe, shift the policy space in some of these types of subsidies that are really not delivering on these public goals that we've been talking about. And as I've said earlier, and everybody said, we need to do this within the framework of the WTO improving fairer trade and reducing trade distorting subsidies. But I think even within that frame, taking a hard look at some of these other areas. I think the other thing that would be interesting, as part of the peer-to-peer learning that the Just Rural Transition is going to be engaging in, is offering WTO members the chance to hear from some of the countries like China, like the EU, others who are moving in this direction, to help them see some pathways forward to shifting their own policy framework to be more sustainable and healthier. So I think those would be, and then just finally, I do think, I know the WTO is engaged in some of these international dialogues that we've mentioned, the Food System Summit, but I think it's really important to link up what the WTO is trying to do and is about to the Biodiversity Summit, to the Food System Summit, to the COP26, because this is all of a piece. These are not segregated conversations. Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Anne. John, over to you.
Well, first of all, I agree with everything I've heard from my colleagues. The COVID crisis and the much longer term overarching climate crisis means that we cannot continue with business as usual. The agri-food systems have been really put to the test in the last years in terms of resilience, in terms of sustainability, and I think our trade policy collectively and in the WTO needs to be adjusted or repurposed even to reflect that this reality. I mean, trade policy is an end in itself, but it's also a means to achieve other goals in sustainability, climate, etc. And I think we need to really seriously in the WTO look at whether we can move the discussion in WTO in the direction of what Anne was referring to and others, onto climate issues, onto resilience issues, onto questions on the relationship between food security, poverty, and trade in agriculture, and inevitably, and we support this on subsidization policies and their impact on food security and sustainable development.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, your views.
Thank you. Yeah, so two things. I'd probably highlight from the issues that are on the WTO agenda, the question of farm subsidy reform, agricultural domestic support. How do we move towards more sustainable and equitable outcomes? I think everyone agrees it needs to happen. Now we need to move to the nuts and bolts of turning that into reality. The second one, export restrictions. It's really important to revisit the rules so that we minimize the impact that measures in this area have on consumers, especially poor and vulnerable consumers, and especially those in net food importing countries. And that's really important in improving the resilience to future shocks, whether they're climate related or otherwise. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, Wanjira has been unable to reconnect, so we won't have any closing remarks from Wanjira. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for taking part in this first session of the second day. I think your comments have been incredibly valuable, and I think the viewers have certainly enjoyed the session, judging by all the questions that have come in. We will now transition to the next session on the program, which is entitled Agricultural Trade and Food Safety. Can I please ask this panel to log off so as to allow the next panel to join? Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye and thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I ask our distinguished panelists for the next session to turn on their cameras? Fantastic. That is great. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can all hear me well. I would like to welcome you again to WTO's virtual agriculture symposium. And the second session this morning will look at the linkages between agricultural trade and food safety. Now, maybe just to start and to say that it is really fundamental that all food is safe for consumption. In other words, there can be no food security without food safety. I think we can all agree on that. Yet, the World Health Organization estimates that 600 million people fall sick after eating contaminated food. And of these people, 420,000 die every year. The World Bank estimates the health and economic cost of unsafe food in low and middle income countries at more than $95 billion US dollars per year. So when it comes to food safety, especially I would say in developing countries, it is clear that we still have a lot of work to do. We are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the WTO agreement on agriculture, yes, but we are also celebrating the 25th anniversary of the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, the SPS agreement. This agreement ensures that food safety requirements are based on science and that they are fit for purpose. And in this way, the agreement protects, on the one hand, public health, and at the same time minimizes unnecessary trade costs and barriers. Now, while we have seen, and we've heard that also yesterday, while tariffs in agri-food products have steadily dropped over the last decades, the use of so-called non-tariff measures in trade is still on the rise. And research shows that SPS measures are among the most frequently applied non-tariff measures and can have a considerable impact on the trade in food and agricultural products. The agriculture sector is also the mainstay of the economy for many developing countries, providing employment to large parts of the population. So meeting food safety standards and other SPS requirements is really important for farmers, for processors, for traders, and for governments in gaining and maintaining access to global and regional markets. Safe trade has the potential to drive economic growth, to increase incomes in poor areas, to improve public health, and to promote food security, all in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, our session today will look at the linkages between agricultural trade and food safety, the role of the SPS agreement and international standards, and also explore some of the emerging trends and developments. My name is Melvin Sprey. I'm the head of the Standards and Trade Development Facility, the STDF, which is a global partnership in SPS capacity development at the WTO. And I will moderate this session this morning today. So let me start the session by introducing our distinguished panelists for this session. Marcus Lipp is joining us today, Senior Food Safety Officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN in Rome. We have Steve Wern, Director, Global Affairs of the UK Food Standards Agency. And I should say that Steve is wearing two hats today. Steve is also the Vice Chairperson of Codex Alimentarius. I'm also very glad that we have with us Katja Onol, who is the Regulatory and Policy Lead at the International Finance Corporation. Mr. Tesfalidet Hagos, who is the founder and the General Manager of Luna Exports in Ethiopia. And finally, and last but not least, Godfrey Bahigwa, the Director of the Department of Rural Economy and Agriculture of the African Union Commission. So a warm welcome to you all. Now, this session is going to be structured in two parts. During the first part, I will ask a number of questions to our panelists, and during the second part, our panelists will take questions from you, from the audience. So I really encourage our registered viewers to send in their questions through the Q&A function, and our panelists will respond to your questions during the second part of this session. So with that sort of short and brief introduction, let me start a first round of questions by asking a question to Marcus. So Marcus, the SPS agreement allows countries to restrict trade in order to ensure that imported food is safe, provided that food safety requirements are based on science. So how should countries go about this, and what's the role of Codex Alimentarius and international standards in all this? Over to you, Marcus.
Thank you so much, Melvin. Thank you for having us. Thanks for the opportunity to participate. It's an excellent question, of course, although I'm slightly intimidated by the presence of Steve Warren when I have to talk about Codex. But I will do my best. So the SPS agreement is, of course, fundamental to trade, is fundamental to the ability of countries to protect their own citizens. And that is for sanitary, phytosanitary aspects. So we're not talking about animal health or plant health here right now, but about food safety. Now, food safety, as you already mentioned in your introduction, is one of the fundamental needs of all human beings. We all need food. It's the third most important thing that every human being needs after air and water. We need food to survive, to thrive, to do anything. And every food needs to be safe. If it's not safe, it's not even food. We just toss it, it becomes waste. It's not consumable, or if it has to be consumed because people are so desperate that there is no alternative, then it will definitely, when food is not safe, we cannot achieve any of the SDGs. Nobody can thrive. Children will not develop to their full potential. None of the human development can take place if food is not safe. So food safety has to be on the top of the agenda of all governments to protect their citizens, to enable all citizens to enjoy access to sufficient amounts of safe and nutritious food. That's one of the fundamental rules. Now, in order to feed everybody in this world, we have to have trade, and that's of course WTO's domain. And to allow sufficient protection of a citizen while not unfairly impede trade, free trade that is, there is a series of rules laid out in various agreements, but one is the SPS agreement, of course, that provides the ability to countries to come up with scientific evidence that may require them to have different rules than agreed by international standard-setting bodies. In this case, for food safety, it's the preeminent body is the Codex Alimentarius Commission. It's a joint FAO-WHO, World Health Organization activity that is supported by both FAO and WHO very heavily with scientific advice, that all the rulemaking, all the standard setting can be based on the best scientific evidence that is available today. This is on an international scale. This is on international harmonization, and the best efforts are put forward by the Codex Alimentarius and by FAO and WHO to deliver that scientific advice to reflect the international community to the best capabilities and with the best data available, limited as they may be in some instances. Now, specific countries may have specific, let's say, dietary habits or specific other aspects that make a group of their population more vulnerable comparatively than in other countries. If that scientific evidence through demonstrated food consumption patterns, through demonstrated scientific evidence in terms of toxicology, so how danger, what is that danger exactly? How would it impact people? If that can be evidenced, that is sufficient proof then, according to my understanding of the SPS terms, that exceptions can be granted and a country can have lower or more stringent food safety standards that are necessary to protect its population and that deviate from the internationally agreed standards that are formulated and promulgated by Codex Alimentarius. So you have had me heard saying a lot about science because that's the core of all of it. The science is our common language. The science is the language we agreed to base our food safety standards on. It's the evidence that allows a transparent and fair and equitable assessment of the risks, of the hazards, of the exposure, of food consumption, of everything that goes into the definition of what makes food safe under certain circumstances for a particular consumer or for a population group. So Codex Alimentarius is the preeminent standard-setting bodies that does its very best to accommodate the needs and requirements of everybody at a global level. However, if and when specific needs can be identified that are applicable only in a specific national setting, exemptions can be granted as long as they're based on science. So it's the same process that is then performed on a national level, that we perform, we, FAO and WHO, on the international level, that would lead then to enough evidence to demonstrate that more stringent requirements are necessary to protect that part of the population that deviate from international standards, and that is acceptable. So I hope that gives you a little bit of background and explains the question. If not, I'm happy to try again. Thank you.
No, it's a perfect answer, and thank you, Marcus. I mean, you said, essentially, yeah, food safety has to be at the top of the agenda for every government. I think we cannot agree to that more. The importance of science, but also the flexibilities built sort of within the system to go over and beyond those standards if necessary, because of, for instance, dietary habits or food consumption patterns and so on. But maybe let's benefit from Steve's presence on this panel, because from the very beginning, Codex was already established like in the 60s, and from the very beginning, Codex work has really been based on building consensus and making decisions based on science. But more recently, we observed that Codex members find it increasingly more difficult to find that consensus and to adopt as standards actually based on science. Can you maybe explain to us a little bit more what's going on? Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Melvin, for your introduction, and thank you to WTO for the invitation to join this esteemed panel this morning. Well, it's morning for me, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone listening in wherever you are. And I'll be speaking, I suppose, from a personal perspective, but a perspective I've gained through engagement with Codex, and as you say, my current role as one of its 3 vice chairpersons. And this isn't the first time I've been posed this challenge, and I'd like to make it clear at the outset that I don't accept the observation that I often hear that Codex members find it difficult to adopt standards based on science. We've got clear and long-standing policy and principles in relation to risk analysis in the Codex procedural manual. Member countries recommitted themselves to adopting science-based texts when agreeing our strategic plan for 2020 to 2025. And one of the 5 strategic goals for Codex in this 6-year period is to develop standards based on science and Codex risk analysis principles. But that having been said, I do agree that on occasion, it's difficult to find consensus in Codex, which is, after all, a multilateral negotiating forum. But those instances are rare. In its 57-year history, the Codex Alimentarius Commission has voted just 14 times on matters related to standards adoption. And those are votes that touch on fundamental principles of Codex, such as basing itself on science and striving to find consensus. And that started with the vote on 4 maximum residue limits in 1991, prior to the establishment of WTO, followed by subsequent votes from 1995 in the WTO era, most notably on certain veterinary drugs used for production enhancement. And most votes ended with a narrow margin for or against, showing how divisive the relevant topics were. And so my conclusion is that although it's rare for Codex to vote, those instances do certainly influence how Codex is perceived, and those 14 votes over 57 years have maybe coloured the perceptions of Codex as an effective global standard setting body. But returning just briefly to the substance of your question, I'd identify, I think, 3 specific challenges for Codex in relation to science. The first is funding for scientific advice, and Marcus will be very familiar from this from discussions we've had between ourselves and in Codex meetings. The strategic plan for 2020 to 2025 notes the strong scientific base for Codex is threatened by the risk, I should say, of unsustainable funding. And so Codex members have urged FAO and WHO to step up their efforts to ensure sufficient and sustainable funding for the joint FAO-WHO scientific advice programme. And we all recognise the positive discussions that have taken place in the FAO governing bodies and the commitments in the World Health Assembly resolution on food safety. And those discussions and commitments need to be reflected in sustainable funding mechanisms, because scientific advice, and I'm sure Marcus would agree with this, remains key to promoting sound science-based international standards. My second point is that we are operating often at the forefront of scientific knowledge, and the objective of Codex to address current, emerging and critical issues such as antimicrobial resistance means that scientific knowledge in some of these areas will be incomplete and evolving. And that doesn't preclude us from elaborating a Codex text, and such situations are envisaged in the Codex procedural manual, which directs us then to consider the development of codes of practice rather than numerical standards. But we need to ensure, in such cases in particular, that we're transparent about the sources of uncertainty and the assumptions we're using when developing a text. And my third scientific challenge, if you like, is the need for multidisciplinarity. And to be clear, I fully support the call I often hear that Codex texts need to be science-based. And we need to be open to insights from across the spectrum of sciences to inform our work. So let's continue to recognise the robust insights that may be provided by the economic and other social sciences too, both in terms of regulatory design and also in the evaluation of the impacts of different interventions in different national and international settings. And one such example is the need for social science insights that's been recognised in the proposal for new work on allergen labelling that the Codex Alimentarius Commission approved last year. So let's be truly multidisciplinary. Thanks, Melvin.
Thanks, Steve. Those were some really good points, actually, that you made. The need for sustainable funding, for scientific advice in Codex. The fact also that science is evolving, that there are uncertainties around science sometimes, but that there's a need to be transparent and a need also to accommodate multiple disciplines. I would like to actually go to Godfrey. Godfrey, because in Africa, well, let's first say that in many parts of the world, we see a tendency, let's say, towards increased protectionism, and we have seen maybe a little bit of that even more in the aftermath of COVID-19. But Africa is actually opening up to trade with the adoption of the African Continental Free Trade Area. What, in your view, are the main challenges in Africa related to trade and food safety? And how can countries in Africa reap the benefits from trade openings at a regional level? Over to you, Godfrey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melvin. Africa is very excited about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. As you know, it will create a market of about 1.3 billion people. And trading is expected to commence on January 1st, 2021. And as a matter of fact, this weekend, there is going to be an extraordinary meeting of the AU Assembly that will discuss, among other things, the final preparations for commencing trade. And Africa wants to keep its borders open to trade because of the various opportunities that the trade area presents for economic growth and transformation. And as you heard yesterday, trade helps to increase incomes of producers, reduce consumer prices for especially importing countries, in the process contribute to food and nutrition security by filling food deficits, create jobs for our youth along the value chain, and stimulate agro-industrialization, because as you know, it is easier to trade in processed foods than in raw foods. So there are enormous benefits, and hence the excitement among AU member states to keep borders open rather than adopt restrictive trade measures. However, there are quite a few challenges as much as there is excitement, and I will pick just three of them. One is to do with infrastructure deficits with regard to road and rail networks that are needed to reduce transaction costs for business to be able to deliver goods and food and other agricultural goods at competitive prices across our borders. And therefore, investments are needed to increase connectivity across the continent. And as you heard earlier in the earlier panel from Wanjira Maathai, it is cheaper to import rice from Asia or chicken from Brazil than it is within our continent. Related to food safety, there are also infrastructure deficits because across the continent, there are not enough laboratories to test samples. And this is something that is required for certification of tradable products. The second constraint I identify are the supply side constraints. Africa is not producing enough food on the continent. And as a result, we have a huge import bill that is estimated at about $45 billion a year and expected to rise to 110 billion by 2025. And these are food imports from outside the continent. And therefore, we believe that boosting intra-Africa trade, countries must increase food production. You cannot trade what you have not produced, especially for the main food imports that we consume on the continent, such as rice, maize, wheat, and their derivative products. So increasing food production on the continent is a key constraint and a priority. The third, I would categorize as the policy and institutional constraints. To facilitate trade, it will be important to remove, as other panelists have mentioned, non-tariff barriers to trade that are rampant across the continent, ranging from simple things like police checks on transportation routes to lengthy administrative procedures at border crossing points, which waste time and increase transaction costs for businesses. And regional economic communities will be important because they are building blocks for successful trading on the continent. As such, it will be important to ensure that policy and standards harmonization across the continent takes place. A cereal product produced in South Africa should have the same standards as that is produced in Egypt, Senegal, or Cameroon. So finally, how can countries benefit from the opportunities that the free trade area will present? One, as I said earlier, it presents opportunities to increase production of agricultural commodities in which the countries have comparative advantage. Second, investing in increased connectivity through road and railway networks to reduce transaction costs so that their products can be competitive in the export markets. And third, to cooperate to improve food safety standards and invest in food safety infrastructure, particularly testing laboratories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Godfrey. And so if I may summarize that, you addressed essentially the challenges, and you say, well, there's infrastructure difficulties, transport corridors, but also laboratories, testing equipment, and so on. There are supply side constraints that need to be addressed, and there's policy and institutional constraints as well. There's a need to reduce NTBs, but the RECs also have an important role to play there. Let me stay in Africa a little bit and move over to Tesfalli, because food safety, as we all know, is critical for public health, but it's also very important for the reputation and the profitability of food producers. Now, your company, Luna Exports, has actually succeeded in becoming one of Ethiopia's leading exporters of meat and meat products to Africa, but also to the Middle East. So tell us your story. I mean, what were some of the barriers that you had to overcome in this effort?
Thank you. Thank you for being invited to share my views on this. We, Luna Exports, have been working in the meat export for the last 18 years. We are exporting fresh meat mainly to the Middle East countries and also to some of the Northern African and Southern African countries. We in Ethiopia, we have a very large population of livestock. We believe and claim to be the 10th largest population, to have the 10th largest population in the world and the first in Africa. We do have 12 to 15 million people who are engaging in livestock and called like pastoralists, who make their living with livestock, and they do live in a very extensive area. I believe that creating efficient international trade in livestock industry will definitely create a better livelihood to this large number of people who are living under poverty in our world. and the impact that it will create on their living is not only limited to their economic betterment, but it will also create a better social impact, like sending their children to school, avoiding early child marriage, and this type of issues, which do have a very negative impact on their livelihood. To mention some of the major challenges that we faced in having this international trade, of course, I can say the major issue that has been very, very difficult for us to deal with is creating the synergy between the traditional way of husbandry system that we have in our country or in Africa and the ever increasing stringent international sanitary and phytosanitary requirements that are being laid time after time. We have tried to keep the international standard requirement by implementing the FSSC 22000, which is the highest standard food safety management system in the world at this level. As a private operator, it was difficult because we have to set up the mind of our employees that food safety is a very critical and important area that we need to focus on in order to do our international trade with the rest of the world. But we have done this in the meat processing plant, and it's very difficult to apply it to the rest of the pastoralists that I mentioned, like 12 to 15 million people. So as a project which we have been working in relation with IFC, with a strong technical assistance that we got from IFC, we have launched a project to support pastoralists to implement a better and modern husbandry system in raising their animals, like supporting them in fodder production, supporting them in veterinary implementations, supporting them in breed improvement and this type of things. Once we succeed with that, we believe that the productivity of the pastoralists will increase and they will have better income. And definitely it will be possible to talk about the food safety and other issues that were already mentioned. I cannot really, unlike most of the scientists in different organizations, sometimes it's very difficult for me to comprehend or to distinguish food safety and livelihood. For people who are very difficult to live, implanting the idea of food safety may be very difficult. So unless and otherwise, we try to look at them in the same way and to put in place the importance of food safety by increasing the livelihood of the people, I don't really think that it will be possible to just put the food safety issue in their agenda. I like to take this opportunity for all the support that we got from IFC, it's a World Bank subsidiary organization, that has given us a technical support in order to make sure that we have proper and strong linkage with the farmers, with the pastoralists in the backward level, and help them, as I mentioned earlier, with the fodder production, with breed improvement, with the veterinary provision, and all these things. I believe that once we get successful with these things, it will be possible to at the same time implant the issue of food safety. I hope I have addressed some of the questions that you mentioned. I will come back again for the rest of the issues. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. That's valid, and I think you made two important points. One is the impact that improved food safety has on people, not only on health, but also on their economic well-being. Indeed, as you said, this allows also, at some point to send, the children to school. But also that food safety really starts at the farm, and it starts at, raising animals. It starts at looking at things like animal feed and so on. So those are, I think, two important points. You mentioned already IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and I would like to turn to Katja actually. Yeah, because traditionally what we see is that food safety regulation, SPS measures essentially, is really based on enforcement through inspection of facilities and testing and penalties for violations. But we are seeing a growing interest in other approaches to regulation, co-regulation, and also other forms of public-private partnership. What's your view on these developments? Over to you, Katja.
Yeah, thank you, Melvin, very much. First of all, for the invitation to participate in this discussion, and also for including this really great and important question in this discussion. Well, I would like to focus on preconditions of efficiency of the approach that you've just mentioned. In my work, I often assess national food safety systems, and this is done in order to identify gaps and develop recommendations for the system to improve. And when doing this, I also compare these weak food safety systems with strong food safety system, and was thinking if there is any pattern that could explain why national food safety systems in one countries are strong and in other countries they are weak. And I did find a formula. It's a 3-element formula, and I think that you've already intrigued and want to hear the elements of this formula. So actually, the answer was on surface, and when I saw it for myself, I just understood that it's so easy and it's obvious, but in reality, it's not often followed in the countries that now are trying to strengthen their national food safety system. So what are these 3 elements? It's prevention and protection, it's awareness and partnership. So I call it PAP formula or PAP approach to food safety, where prevention and protection might seem to be again obvious for all of us who are participating in this discussion. And it's clear that prevention and protection of consumers should be at the core of any public intervention in food safety management on national level. However, in reality, it is not always so. Let's look at inspections. Quite often in countries where food safety systems are weak, the role of inspectors when they visit food processing facilities or farms is not to find incompliances and prevent outbreaks and prevent produce of unsafe foods, but quite often it is to find incompliances and to fine food business producer. So this is to be changed because, again, I do not know why it happens. Maybe because of lack of understanding from inspector's side that the main purpose of this inspection and the main purpose of enforcement of food safety regulation is to protect consumers, is again prevent production of unsafe food. Maybe it's because of lack of awareness among all those who are involved in this food safety management from governmental side. And this awareness is the second element of this PAP food safety formula that I've mentioned at the beginning. So awareness also, the level of awareness and the attention to awareness on food safety also could show how strong the national food safety system is. I was analyzing the level of awareness about food safety issues, about food safety practices, about food safety outbreaks in such countries as Singapore, that has one of the best food safety systems in the world, in the EU, in New Zealand, and in other countries where they just in the process of strengthening their national food safety system. And I see that in those countries where consumers are really protected, where consumers have trust in food that is protected in their countries, where control is efficient, then the awareness is really on high level. And then the third element of the formula is partnership, but it's not only about public-private partnership. It's about partnership in all dimensions. Again, in many countries where food safety reforms are in process now, you could see that there are numerous food agencies or numerous public agencies that are involved in national food safety management system. And quite often we see that there is a lack of communication between these agencies, lack of coordination of activities between these agencies. There is lack of clarity in mandates of these agencies. And then again, quite often we see the problem of ensuring food safety control through the value chain, because of lack of cooperation and communication between agencies involved in this official control. Some stages of the food value chain might not be controlled at all. Like there might be an agency that is focused on control of primary production of crops that is intended for export. There might be an agency at the same country that is focused on control of food processing, but nobody is focusing on primary production for domestic market. And this situation is not rare. So again, when analyzing this strong food safety system, national food safety system, I saw that once all these three elements has adequate attention from the public side, and they are in balance, I mean, protection, prevention, awareness, and partnership, then the public administration of food safety is really efficient, and the food safety system is strong, consumers are protected. So, and also another observation that in countries where there is clear understanding that the core purpose of governmental intervention in food safety management is to prevent and protect, there are different forms of enforcement mechanism are used. So in these countries, competent authorities are more open to involve private sector in the official control. They are more open and eager to promote co-regulations. They are pushing for establishment of public-private partnership, and they are pushing for very active involvement of consumers who could be the drivers of all positive changes in food safety. So this is what I wanted to share. Yeah, this PAP food safety approach, or PAP formula that could ensure creation of really strong food safety system. Over to you, Melvin.
No, thank you, Katja. And that's actually very, very interesting. You know, you mentioned the elements of a food safety system. You mentioned prevention, protection, awareness, but also partnership. And yeah, as you rightfully say, partnership has many dimensions. And you also raised another important point, which is around, yeah, trade is often a driver for food safety investment. But what about domestic health and domestic food safety, which should probably get more attention. Marcus, would you like to have any comments on food safety systems as well? Over to you.
Thank you, Melvin. And thanks so much, Katja. This was a great intervention. I really like your abbreviation that you came up with. So aside from scientific advice, our group is actually spending significant and quite substantial efforts for quite some years in the development of how to assess food control systems and how to aid countries in the strengthening of capacity of food control systems. That's capacity building, of course, a core activity of FAO. So yes, we have developed a comprehensive food control assessment tool, food control systems assessment tool that reflects every single bit that you mentioned. So there has to be the legal component in place that actually regulators can withdraw material from the market, for example. That legal basis is not always given in all governments or in all legal circumstances. So the legal construct needs to be there that those responsible for food safety actually have also authority to do something about, other than just issuing fines, that they can impound materials, that they can close factories, that they can do something that would protect actually consumers rather than just doling out fines. It is a perpetual problem and a really difficult issue for every government to ensure the intergovernmental collaboration on food safety. They may have a ministry for food safety, or they may have a part that focuses on food safety, that may be in the trade ministry, that may be in the tourism ministry, that may be in the agricultural ministry, wherever it is. But these people need to talk with everybody else, the public health people, the customs people, the police people, whoever does the veterinary surveillance, everything. Food safety is really complicated. It's a systems approach. It goes to the farm, it goes to the farmer, it goes to the consumer. It impacts many, many actors. So it's really, really difficult. And we're going in quite some detail on how to assess that, and more specifically, how to help countries develop evidence that is sufficiently specific that they can improve their food control systems then on a targeted manner to improve the overall situation. Lastly, just that comment, trust, you mentioned trust, absolutely critical, super difficult to establish, very easy to lose, we all know that. And we as consumers essentially have to trust somebody that the food is safe. We cannot detect it ourselves. In most cases, we cannot smell it, we cannot see it. We have to trust the government, we have to trust the producers, industry, farmers, transporters, logistics, processors. Everybody has to play their part. Every single step has to ensure that food is safe. Very, very complicated. I love how you abbreviated that in your moniker, PAP. I think it's fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Marcus, for that additional intervention. And yeah, I also agree that, yeah, before you invest, you need to know what your needs are and you need to assess your needs. And the food control assessment tool is a great instrument for that. And I understand also that that tool is available on FAO's website, and by the way, also on STDF's website. I want to stay with you actually, Marcus, a bit more, because we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, so we're going to look a little bit at some of the trends and developments here. And the pandemic, has caused huge disruptions across markets and supply chains. What guidance do you have for food safety authorities and also food businesses, small, medium enterprises, for instance, and to keep the food supply chain safe? Over to you.
Thank you. Rather challenging question, I have to admit. The pandemic has impacted every economic activity, obviously, on the whole planet, and thus it has impacted food production. Now, I would like to emphasize that COVID-19 is actually not a food safety problem. COVID-19 is transmitted by a droplet transmission, infects people to people, essentially. There has not been any demonstrated case where COVID-19 has been transmitted from food or food packaging. There's always people involved. It's people to people, people on close circumstances. Now, where it gets difficult is and confounding is that those close circumstances and preferable, let's say, beneficial environment happens in slaughtering facilities, for example, where people work very closely together. There's a lot of shouting, there's a lot of droplets that fly through the air that then leads to spikes in infection rates of COVID-19 in food workers. Now, but it's important to remember, I think, for food safety authorities that it is not a foodborne illness. It is not transmitted by food. It is not transmitted by food packaging. It is transmitted by sick people to people. That can impact every single, and does impact every single economic activity. Naturally, wherever people are close, there is the risk of infection. Now that does, where the additional impact and collateral damage, if you want, comes up, is that a huge amount of resources have to be deviated from normal activities to manage the pandemic, to manage the outfall or the consequences of the pandemic. That includes, in many cases, food inspection people. Either the inspectors are actually drawn to other tasks, or the inspectors cannot go to facilities because there's a lockdown, there is no travel, there is something. So a massive amount of retooling is happening, has happened, including remote inspection, including coming up with different procedures for maybe deferring the issuance or renewal of licenses and all these different instruments that go into, say, food production without, while doing that, finding a way that enough surveillance and enough control is still able to the extent to guarantee food safety for everybody. A huge challenge, a huge issue. FAO, WHO, either individually or in some instances jointly, have issued a series of guidance papers and policy papers and other tips to help government in managing this crisis, in particular as it comes to food production and food safety, in how to mitigate the impact. Let's not at least forget that much of the food production outside, let's say, OECD countries is an informal sector, and even within OECD countries is often informal sector employment, where healthcare is not there, where people may live in very close quarters and under difficult circumstances. And those are often the field workers, those are often people that are involved in food production. And if massive amounts of those people turn sick, food production per se is being challenged because material doesn't get from the field, doesn't get harvested, doesn't get processed, and cannot reach the consumer. So the impact of pandemic is, of course, food security. It is a potential shortage of food. We have experienced it here and there. Overall, it appears that the world has managed it reasonably well, but the threat remains that all the collateral effects, the secondary effects of the pandemic severely disrupt our economy, severely disrupt some of the food safety efforts that need to be retooled, that need to be reconfigured, and need to be managed differently in order to maintain food safety as the extent of possible. The only silver lining at the horizon, if you want, is washing your hands. One of the #1 recommendations for COVID-19 prevention or prevention of COVID-19 infections. Washing hands works marvelously well to improve food safety too. So that's maybe the only positive outcome there. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. And I think it's very clear that COVID-19 is indeed not a food safety problem. It's not a food safety. It's not a foodborne illness. Nevertheless, the economic impact of all this is, of course, huge. And most recently, we've been reading in the press, that some countries are putting in place stricter inspection and testing regimes for imports of frozen food due to COVID-19. But then other countries are saying, well, those are measures that are really unnecessary. There's no scientific basis for this. Maybe just very briefly, what's your view on that?
Thank you, Melvin. As Steve said, it's always a little bit difficult to comment while scientific evidence emerges. Now, what we do understand today is, of course, if a sick person handles an object, that object can carry the virus to a lower extent because the transfer is not very efficient. The survival of viruses viruses do not live themselves. Now, biologists may argue with me, but they cannot multiply outside a host organism. In this case, it's us, maybe a mink, some other animals where the virus can live, but it's very, very restricted set of biological organisms where this virus can live. It does not multiply outside its host. So whatever gets contaminated may have trace amount of a virus. Now, these our analytical capabilities, our testing capabilities are totally impressive. Our humans, so scientists' capabilities, and enable us to detect minute and very small amounts of fragments of a virus even. So it is often very, very difficult to evaluate exactly, is it even an intact virus, or is it just a fragment of a virus that was detected? It may be understandable due to the impact of COVID-19 it has on the economy, on livelihoods of people, that those that get severely sick, that everybody is scared and everybody reacts then to a perceived threat. It is our opinion that to this day, we do not have any evidence that food is involved in the transmission of COVID-19, and that would include frozen food and food packaging.
Okay, Marcus, thanks. That's very clear. Maybe staying a little bit with the COVID-19 pandemic, and maybe a question for Steve here, because food safety regulators are adapting to the challenges of maintaining food safety, but also trade during COVID-19. Marcus already mentioned, new technologies, remote inspections, and so on. So essentially, the pandemic also maybe provides opportunities to speed up digitalization, e-commerce, and other technologies. Can you give some examples there? What's your view?
Thanks, Marcus. And I'd like to answer your question and build on the comments that Marcus has made. And as you've both said, the COVID-19 pandemic and its secondary effects have changed the world we live in now for the foreseeable future and maybe forever. As part of that, the pandemic has provided shocks to food trade, distribution, food security, and verification activity at levels from global down to local. And in response, the global food trade has, in large measure, demonstrated its flexibility and resilience. And this is a good time for us to take stock. As both you and Marcus have rightly said, COVID-19 is a respiratory illness and not a foodborne illness. But food hygiene remains fundamental to protect consumers from a range of microbiological risks. And codex texts, such as the General Principles for Food Hygiene, are key reference text for examples when identifying and mitigating risks relating from changes that businesses have had to embrace as a result of the pandemic, maybe change to sources of ingredients or distribution routes. So early in the pandemic, we published on the Codex website a compendium of the key food safety texts relevant to this challenge from our food hygiene and import-export certification committees. And that's still there on the website if you look at the Codex website and search for COVID. And it's true that practices in the food trade and practices of national regulatory and enforcement bodies have needed to adapt to the circumstances of the pandemic. You mentioned digitization and e-commerce, and we've seen innovative use of virtual and remote audit and verification, as Marcus has identified. So where are we now? Well, some relevant standards development work, for example, guidance on paperless use of electronic certification, is already at an advanced stage in Codex technical committees. It started several years ago. We'll be responsive to any proposals from Codex members for new standards development work that would allow us to share and embed our learning from the use of innovative approaches deployed through the pandemic. And for example, just as one example, Australia, as chair of the Codex Committee on Food Import and Export Certification Systems, CCFIX, has flagged that it's considering bringing forward new work proposals on relevant matters within its remit, and in particular, and for example, remote and virtual audit and verification activity. We've seen that used differently to different extents and in different ways, both by national food authorities and by players in the food trade. And it would be really good, I think, to try to identify some general guidelines that we could all use to understand how best that virtual activity may be undertaken. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. That was really interesting, and also about sort of the future possibilities in paperless trade and electronic certification. I think that's also really something to look out for. Katja, I understand you would also like to provide a few comments on the COVID-19 situation. Over to you.
Yes, I just want to mention that based on our experience and what we see in all over the world, in Africa and also in Asia, this COVID-19 pandemic had a positive impact on food safety situation, because more and more attention is now paid to food hygiene. We got requests from West African countries to help to develop guides on food hygiene for farmers. So also there are requests from other countries in Eastern Europe to help with guides that might help again to improve food hygiene during food production. And it's so interesting that in reality, there are the same procedures that we are talking about. There is nothing new is developed to improve this food hygiene linking to COVID-19 crisis, but the attention to the necessity to improve food hygiene, to follow these good food hygiene practices increased. And this is, I think, that's a good thing. That's finally, unfortunately, because of that, not a good reason, but and the result, we have increased attention to food safety issues, and more people, even at homes, they are paying more attention to hand washing, to keeping their products in proper way in fridges. Again, thinking about their health. Yeah, more than they did it before. Thank you.
I think, Katja, thanks. That's a very interesting observation, actually. You're saying, yeah, COVID-19 actually has a positive impact on food safety and food hygiene in particular. With that, I might actually want to go to Tesfalida and ask him in Luna Exports, you know, what does COVID-19 practically mean for your business? I mean, do you also observe this increased focus on food hygiene? And also, are you, you know, after COVID-19, are you exporting more? Are you exporting less? I mean, are you diversifying markets? What's happening there? Can you enlighten us? Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to mention my full agreement and alignment with what Katja just mentioned. I was going to say that most of the practices that we need to do in order to prevent the COVID-19 or to decrease its impact are like washing hands, wearing masks, using sanitizers, and these type of things, which are completely in line with the food safety regulations that are required. We've been using most of these things while in our food processing plant, but unfortunately, one good thing that the COVID-19, even though it's not a good cause, one good thing that it has brought is that people could really understand why these things were regulated, why these things were very important, why these things were mentioned to be practiced again and again and again. So I can say that the food safety concept starts from the mindset. And the COVID-19 has helped us to strengthen the mindset that's related with food safety. When I come back to your question, the COVID-19 after, I can say that it has affected us like anybody else. It has affected us in our international trade because our exporting or importing countries where we are exporting our product are affected by the COVID-19. The tourist flow has decreased significantly, and you know that the demand may have decreased, even though it's not a severe impact as it should be. Our export operation has decreased slightly. On top of that, we have introduced like because in meat processing plants, as was mentioned earlier, the possibility of the impact of the COVID-19 can be, the infection can be much higher. We have decreased our staff that works at a time, and we have started employing in a shift. We have put a lot of measures which helped us at least to mitigate the impact of its spread. So I can say that the international trade has been affected by the COVID-19, and we're also affected by it, but it's not as much as it should be. Like the hotel industry, the airline industry are very much affected, but we are not that much affected as it would affect the rest of the industries. Thank you.
Thank you, just validate. And well, it is encouraging to hear, of course, that the company is essentially implementing all the measures that are recommended by all the experts that spoke just before you. So that's really good. Maybe staying in Africa, Godfrey, I want to ask a question to you, because I mean, there are many opportunities, as you already mentioned in your first intervention, for collaboration at regional level, to improve food safety and promote regional trade. What's the African Union doing to turn those into reality? And I'm aware that there is discussion around establishing an African food safety agency. How would that agency, help consumers in Africa? Over to you.
Thank you, Melvin. Let me say I have enjoyed listening to Mr. Hagos because it's good to hear from practitioners who are living, who are practicing the theories that we speak about regularly. So thank you, Mr. Hagos, for sharing your perspectives. So Melvin, as I said earlier, regional economic communities are the basis for integration in Africa. Very important. And therefore will be a key determinant for the success of trade under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Through regional cooperation, infrastructure can be improved, and we have seen several projects of continental nature taking place across Africa. So quite reassuring. And also it is through these regional economic communities that policy harmonization or improving food standards can take place. And also this regional cooperation is key to improving the infrastructure that is needed for promoting food safety. And in some cases, we are promoting or asking regional economic communities to collaborate in developing regional infrastructure for food safety, especially regional food testing laboratories. And we have several examples where that cohesion is happening. The East African community is one of them. Quite well connected, both on the surface and in air. And so is ECOWAS and SADC. Now, what is the AU Commission trying to do, or what is the AU Commission doing in order to promote both trade and food safety? The AU Commission is absolutely committed to seeing increased integration across Africa, and through the AU Development Agency, NEPAD, it is pursuing several regional and continental infrastructure development projects, the success of which will increase the connectivity across the continent, reducing transaction costs, and boost trade under the continental free trade area. Second, both the AU Commission and regional economic communities have established a media coordination mechanism that aims to improve the working relationships between the two organizations to pursue improved implementation and delivery of the continental agenda. And three, in order to improve coordination on food safety, as you have mentioned, Melvin, the AU Commission is working to establish the Africa Food Safety Agency. And the agency will seek to support member states and regional economic communities to work towards policy harmonization, standards harmonization, together with the recently established Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat that is now operational in Accra, Ghana. Fourth, the AU Commission has developed a continental SPS policy framework, and we are now in the process of developing a food safety strategy to facilitate the implementation of the policy framework through its domestication at both national and regional level. And finally, the AU Commission also supports its member states and regional economic communities to create functional partnerships within Africa and globally. And in the area of improving food safety standards, we cooperate with and would like to strengthen our cooperation with the WTO's Standards and Trade Development Facility to support our efforts in improving the capacity in food safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Godfrey. And of course, the STDF is more than ready to help you in all your efforts. There's definitely a lot going on in Africa at the moment, I believe, and there are lots of opportunities, but also some challenges in linking up the various initiatives and NAPAD, CADAP, REX, African Union Commission, African Continental Free Trade Area. You also spoke a lot about the need for more investment, and that's a question actually I want to ask Katja, because we all agree that more investment in food safety is needed, but how should we help farmers and businesses to scale up and make those investments? Over to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Melvin. First of all, I'd like to say that IFC Food Safety Global Platform now is cooperating with NAPAD, and I'm happy that one of experts, advisors on food safety will participate in our webinar that we will have on December 9th on the importance of food safety regulations, like food safety regulations now your way. And it is great that now in African Union, there is a clear understanding on the need of specific focus on food safety issues. And you have a team that is focused on this issue. So this is great. And now answering your question, Melvin, about investment. I think that the issue now for farmers and food business is not just to find investments to improve their business and to improve food safety on their business, but to learn and to focus on how to use these investments in proper way. I'm happy that we have Mr. Hagas here from Luna. And I'm happy that my colleagues cooperated with Luna food safety expert, and we together achieved great results. And now we have really strong food safety management system. And your company is one of the best examples on that. The importance of the precondition of successful business is not only to have these investments, but to know how to use them and what is to be considered. Last year, before the COVID crisis, I was traveling in Central Asian countries and visited a number of greenhouses and cold storages and food processing facilities. And in every company, our team was told about the amount of capital investment they spent to buy this new equipment, or they spent to construct this workshop, or they spent to build some new facilities. And my question about how much do they spend on training for their staff, how much do they spend on educating their staff, was absolutely not clear for most of farmers and food producers. And at the same time, when looking at these greenhouses or cold storages, I saw cases. There were cases when agrochemicals were stored in a proper way, in not proper way, or there was not enough. There was not enough done for personal hygiene of workers on these farms. And we started a discussion on this, explaining how this could impact their business and why it is so important to pay attention to trainings and to educate their staff. Because we all know that food safety depends on the hazards, biological, chemical, physical, and allergens. But the biggest hazard on this food production is human human being. So you could buy the best ever equipment. You could spend $100,000 to install this equipment and to bring it to the country. But then if your staff doesn't know how to wash hands properly and why do they need to wash these hands properly, then of course the result might be really terrible for the company. So that's why I think that now business farmers, they need to pay more attention on this training. Again, this is about the importance of awareness campaign, and this is where developing partners and public authorities need to help business and agri sector. Otherwise, I think it's hardly possible to ensure the development of food business and food industries. And also in this regard, I'd like to mention the IFC Food Safety Handbook that we call the GPS for food safety and GPS for food industry, that could be found on our website. It's ifc.org/food-safety. So you could find link to this handbook where we provide different approaches, different practical tools that could be used by food business to improve their food safety. I think that, and it is important that the top management of companies understand the need of education of its staff, because if there is no such understanding, then there might be problems with business even after having these great investments to buy equipment. Thank you. Over to you, Melvin.
No, thank you, Katja. That was really good. And essentially you're driving down at the point that it's not only about more investment, it's also about better investment. I mean, you can buy all the equipment that you want, but if you have nobody that is trained on how to use it, then it becomes useless in a way. And sometimes, I mean, speaking from my own experience, I can see a similar pattern when investments are made in laboratories. You have many state-of-the-art laboratories, but you have no one actually in those laboratories to actually do the tests. So this is a really important point, I think. We actually have approximately 15 minutes left. It started to become a bit of a debate as well, this panel, which I think is good. But there are quite a few questions from the audience. So I would pose these questions to specific panelists, but I would kindly ask you to try to be brief in responding to those questions, so we can take a few of them. And the first question is for Marcus, actually. The question from a viewer is that given that the FAO houses the IPPC Secretariat, could you mention the importance of phytosanitary requirements to protect plant health and food production?
Sure, and thank you for the question, and thanks to the audience member for that question. So IPPC, the International Plant Protection Convention, is also housed at FAO. It is one of the three sisters, the so-called three sisters, that are instrumental to enforce SPS agreement, the SPS agreement. One is Codex Alimentarius, the second one is IPPC, the third one is OIE for animal health. So IPPC sets the standards and rules for international standards and rules for plant health. Plant health is absolutely critical for food production because plants either serve as food directly or plant products, or as feed, then that goes into animal production. So we all depend on the sufficient production of plant material and sufficient growth of plants that they either then produce our foods or our feed. Plant health will invariably, or let's say, agents that threaten plant health, insects, plant diseases, viral or bacterial plant diseases, invariably will threaten the output and the production volumes of plants, or let's say ultimately then our food and plant-derived food or feed. And hence plant health is critical for food security. If there's not enough material to go around, then that's by definition food insecure status or hunger, if it's really bad. Rice, corn, all these products are derived from plant. If plants are sick, there will not be enough of those food products. We will not have food security. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. I have a question for Godfrey. A viewer says, well, African countries are able to meet international food safety standards for food exports, but not enough is done for the general public on the continent itself. Is the recently introduced African Food Safety Index considered in discussions around the African Continental Free Trade Area? And how can this index help towards harmonization of food safety standards on the continent? Over to you, Godfrey.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, well, a little background, we have what is called the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, a biennial review report. This report is prepared every 2 years for presentation to heads of state and government on the implementation of the Continental Agriculture Transformation Agenda. That report has 49 indicators, and one of those indicators was on food safety. We introduced it in the last report, in the 2019 report that we presented this year in February to the AU Assembly. Basically to try to promote the importance of food safety on the continent. And we're increasing to popularize it through the various dialogues that we hold at continental, regional, and also encouraging member states to have that discussion on how to improve food safety at country level. But actually what we are planning to do for the third report, which we shall produce in 2021, for presentation to the Assembly in January 2022, is to broaden that index, not just to cover food safety, but to be an SPS index, which will then incorporate plant health and animal health. So we want to have a broader index on SPS rather than just food safety. And again, it's gradual work that we are doing on the continent, and we use it to advocate for increased attention by our leaders on SPS matters in general, but in this case, starting with food safety. Thank you.
Thanks, Godfrey. And I think the idea about this SPS index is a really interesting one, and perhaps we can have a follow-up discussion about that at some point. It does make sense sometimes to look at food safety, animal health, and plant health together, because in the end, all the three kind of sub-areas are covered by the same principles of the SPS agreement. And it also sometimes makes sense to look at these areas together because of limited resources. So you have to share resources. I have a question from the audience for Katja. And the question is, looking at developing countries with their large informal and unregulated sectors, their small fiscal base and their strong dependence on foreign state funds for infrastructure, training measures, have you seen any examples of countries that have progressed in improving food safety? And what were the motors of the progress, of the success? Over to you, Katja.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Melvin. I'll share one example from Myanmar, where public awareness campaign played an important role in improving good agricultural practices in tomato growing. There is a region in the lake in Myanmar which is famous for its tomatoes. But some time ago, farmers started use of agrochemicals, and without understanding how to use these agrochemicals in proper way, and they just pour as much as they had into water, because these are floating orchards, tomato orchards. And because they thought that the more they have of these fertilizers in water, the better would be the harvest. But then they faced a problem of water contamination, soil contamination, and of course, high residue levels in tomatoes. So this problem was understood by the Ministry of Agriculture, and they analyzed how they could address it. So they started the massive campaign on promoting Global Gap, Myanmar Global Gap, and they started with providing access to information to farmers, even in remote areas. So they created gap units, and the teams of people who were visiting farmers, who were providing them trainings on how to, what is good agricultural practices, how to use these chemical inputs, why it is not good even for human health and for environment and for the harvest, to use all packages of this fertilizer that they have, and farmers saw in quite a short period of time, they saw the results, good results of these good agricultural practices, and they were convinced that this is what they need, and this of course substantially impacted the safety of products that they grown. And as a result, just in a few years, the area of Global Gap tomatoes grew from 50 acres to 426 acres. And the number of Gap tomato farmers in this district increased from 54 to 306. Moreover, the awareness campaign created demand among consumers in these Gap products and these gap fruits and vegetables, because before consumers didn't understand what is the difference between just ordinary tomatoes and these tomatoes from Gap farm. So this awareness campaign really helped a lot in improving practices and in creating a demand among consumers for safer food, and this influenced the whole process in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja. And I'm aware that we're reaching almost the end of the session. We have more or less 3 minutes left. I have one question for Steve from the audience. Steve, very briefly, it's difficult to reach consensus in Codex. Do you have any personal advice on how to speed up the standard development and adoption process, given that it sometimes takes very long? Has going virtual helped in speeding up the standard setting process? Maybe you could just enlighten us very, very briefly on that.
I think going virtual might do. We're still learning how to work in the virtual environment. We successfully convened a commission meeting over several sessions just a few weeks ago, over 700 participants, interpretation into the 6 UN languages. We completed our agenda of standard setting. I think the biggest advantages of working in the virtual environment are the opportunities for informal discussion between either bilaterally or regionally or globally, and we need to really harness those advantages if we're going to drive forward our standard setting agenda. So hopefully we can reap some opportunities and speed things up. But I do think we need to acknowledge that the 8-step process for setting standards in Codex does deliver on key elements of collaboration and inclusivity and transparency, and we should look carefully before we suggest any changes that might underline any of those core principles of Codex. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve, for that. I mean, we're nearing the end of this session, so I would like to give all of you, I would say 15 seconds, essentially, to provide us and the audience with your key message, your key takeaway from this session. And so in terms of the order, I would like to start with Tesfalidet, then Godfrey, then Katja, then Marcus, and finally Steve. So really short, really 15 seconds so we can finish on time. Thank you.
Thank you. My major take from this session is that we have to approach we have to have a kind of a balancing approach between the food safety regulations that are already mentioned and the production system level in the developing countries. It's a learning process. It's a process that we cannot really achieve overnight. So I believe that the food safety regulators have to take into consideration the fact that it's possible to achieve to that level, but it has to be done step by step. It cannot be done overnight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Godfrey.
Yes, Thank you, Melvin. I think for me, the key takeaway message is that in Africa, we need to invest in a food safety infrastructure to improve nutrition outcomes on the continent. And at the same time, that will be a precursor to boosting trade in agricultural goods and services on the continent.
Thank you, Katja.
Well, I would encourage all those who are involved in food safety reforms to consider this PAP food safety approach. It's prevention, awareness, and partnership. Just check if the recommendations you provide are based on this. Thank you.
Marcus?
Well, food safety is everyone's business because we all need safe food. So in the spirit of the food systems approach, the only way to increase food safety is we increase the capacities of everyone. Consumers, regulators, industry, producers, farmers, logistics, everyone needs to have increased capacities and food can become safer. Thank you.
Steve?
Thanks. We haven't had the opportunity to discuss preparation for the UN Food Systems Summit next year to any great extent. So as people's minds start to turn to that, I would just like to land a couple of key points: that we can't separate agricultural production and food safety from the need to protect, restore and promote sustainable use of our land, that we need to build on the foundation of environmental science and what that's telling us about how to protect biodiversity, and all actors in the food chain, from farm to fork, have a stake and a role in adopting more sustainable ways of producing and consuming our food. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And indeed, the Food Systems Summit will be organized next year, so this is all to be continued. We've come to the end of this session, and I'd really like to thank our panelists for their excellent contributions. Definitely, I learned a lot myself. We are now going to break for lunch in Geneva, at least. The next session in the symposium on the future of agricultural trade will start at 2 p.m. here in Geneva time. So that's 1 hour from now. That session will be moderated by my colleague, Cédric Pen. Thank you all very much for your participation in this session, and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.